This is the Comics Alternative, our June on location episode at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek.
And I'm Michael. And we are two guys and a guest talking about two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And in fact, on this particular episode, and by the way, we are at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find in Charlotte, North Carolina. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue. If you're in the area, definitely make it a point to come by. Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Lots of comics, great guys who work here who will help you, and it's just a great shop. It's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And as always, I want to thank them for allowing us to come into their shop on a Wednesday night and talk about comics. Now, listeners of the podcast may recognize Michael's voice. It was back, I think, in April that you brought your class in here.
Yes, I did.
And so we talked with not only you, but we talked with members of your class. That was a very lively episode. Since that time, Michael and I have been formulating an idea of what to do with the on-location show. And in fact, we've decided to take it to twice a month, and we're going to try to keep up with that regimen. And in order to do it twice a month, I really didn't want to do it just by myself, and so I asked Michael if he would co-host these on-location shows, and he gladly consented. So thank you, Michael.
My pleasure to do so.
And we also were coming up with kind of a loose formula. You know, in the past for on-location shows, every now and again we'll have a theme, but for the most part, it has been me going into the shop, whether it's here at Heroes or when I was back in my shop in Plano, Texas. And I would just go in and talk with customers and employees about what they're reading, what they come in on that particular Wednesday to pick up, what they're excited about, what they're looking forward to. So it was kind of a loose conversation. And we still want to maintain that kind of looseness and openness when it comes to discussing comics in a broader sense and pulling other people into the conversation. But Mike and I thought that we'd do something a little more structured. What we'll try to do on these on-location shows is both Mike and I will point out something recent, maybe the previous week. I mean, not coming out the day that we're in the shop, because we really haven't had the time to read those yet. Those. So in other words, we won't be discussing material coming out on the 20th of June as we're recording this. But we can talk about one or two titles from the previous week, for example, last week, the 13th, or maybe 2 weeks ago. And since Mike...
And even stretch that a little bit.
And even stretch that. and since Mike
for slow readers.
Is much more versed in the mainstream superhero universe than I am, he's going to be dealing more, not exclusively, but he's going to be dealing more with mainstream publishers than I am. And I'm going to be dealing more with, I don't know if you want to call them alternative or indie, in other words, non-mainstream publishers and titles of things that I've noted or excited about or have read that came out a week or two previously. And so along the way, as we talk about what we're interested in, what we've been reading that's recent, we'll pull in other people, such as Zig, who has been on the show quite a number of times now, and who's sitting right across from us. Hey, Zig, how you doing?
Hello. I'm not sure, I guess quite a number of times now, how much of a reward is on the wanted poster.
That's okay. We appreciate your feedback.
We're cool. All right.
And in fact, you pull in more conversation when it comes to the mainstream than I have been able to provide. So you and Mike can tag team there. So let's go ahead and get started with this relatively new format, I guess, kind of a loose format. So Mike, what has come out relatively recently that you've been reading that you're excited about?
Well, one of the things that I want to talk about, and we'll stretch the boundaries of recently, is the new edition of Tom King and Mitch Gerads' graphic novel, The Sheriff of Babylon, which was originally published by Vertigo several years ago, recently collected an oversized edition. I guess I'm already sort of testing the boundaries of mainstream, but that was published by DC under its Vertigo imprint. Mm-hmm. I think that is a terrific graphic novel, one of the best I've read from the mainstream. I'll continue to use that term, whatever the heck that means. It's a crime thriller set in Iraq shortly after the American invasion, during the occupation. And I think it is a beautifully structured narrative. It evokes, for me, as someone coming from the world of literary studies, the kind of writing that we associate with Graham Greene or Joseph Conrad or John le Carre. It uses the techniques of comics in very interesting ways, albeit with a basic grid of 9 panels from many pages, not departing from that format. But Tom King, who I think is one of the most interesting writers working in comics now, again in mainstream comics, brings to this a kind of structural complexity, certainly a nuanced approach to characterization, a great sense of plotting, many of the characteristics that I would associate with as classic a graphic novel as Watchmen by Alan Moore. And I think in a lot of ways, and we can talk about this as we go along, that Tom King's role as a writer, again in the mainstream world of comics, is perhaps now as, I don't want to say as influential, but brings a level of artistry to that I would associate with the kind of work that Alan Moore was doing in the mid to late 1980s.
Now, you mentioned his work in the mainstream, and he works primarily, I guess now exclusively at DC, but he's also done Marvel work. Didn't he do The Vision?
He did, series, yeah. 12-issue series, The Vision for Marvel. That was where I was introduced to his work for the first time. I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know his name. That's a kind of suburban horror comedy set around The Vision, trying to build his own family and live a moderately normal life in the suburbs. It's replete with references to Marvel history, to the complicated history of the Vision as a character, but I think really pushes that in new directions. I'm very interested as a scholar in superhero narratives, and I think one of the great questions about that is whether those narratives can be about anything other than superhero narratives. Do they only exist as commentary on the many, many decades of history associated with those characters? And his series on the Vision, I think, is one that really pushes beyond the boundaries of that and uses the kind of symbolism of those characters to comment on a lot of larger issues about family life, about conforming as one tries to living in middle America. So really interesting stuff that way.
Yeah. Zig, did you read The Vision?
I loved The Vision. Well, one of the things that I really loved about it was that it played with time. It played with the concept of time in a way that reminiscent of both Faulkner and Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Or possibly Bill and Ted's X.
Two works we often use in the same breath.
I mean, exactly. But at some level, I mean, one of the interesting things about that is it's the same stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you're pulling things from different, also what the most classic might be 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's almost as though it's 4-dimensional, meaning that you see that some stuff is going to happen way ahead of time. Telegraphing that, but then it's not. Which is, to your point, it's about it's about the fact that you already know these characters. Sure. You know something's going to happen. Yeah. You're telegraphed that way ahead of time. And then it's how you play with that. So, I mean, at some level, what was it? Bertolt Brecht's alienation effect.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. You do sort of you see sort of those aspects of it. So yeah, I mean, Vision was kind of cool, but it was also but while I was dealing with all those issues, I wasn't as emotionally involved in that story as I was with, say, Thor. But didn't make it any less fun.
Yeah. That's on my reading list now that, I guess, a few months ago, the deluxe collection of The Vision has come out. And I did get that, and I've heard so many good things about it. So that's on my reading list, just as the completion of Sheriff of Babylon. Now, it's been, 3 years ago that the first issue of Sheriff of Babylon came out, because there was several new Vertigo series at the time,
right,
and that was one of them. And I remember doing a show on those new Vertigo titles, and we discussed the first issue on the show. I've since gone on to read, I don't know, the next 2 or 3 issues after that. But then I kind of put it on hold, waiting for the collection. Mm-hmm. Now that the collection's out, I still haven't read it, but it's on my reading list.
Yeah.
And so I just need to find the time. I need to take the time to actually get around to that.
Right.
So I can have a Tom King fest.
Some of the same experiments with storytelling and chronology that Zig mentioned in The Vision are there in Sheriff of Babylon as well, and that adds just an extra layer of complexity to the work.
Yeah. Yeah, he seems to be one of the most sophisticated writers in comics today.
Yeah. Very, very distinct dialogue style. The rhythm of the dialogue is beautifully matched with the rhythm of the design of the pages, the movement from panel to panel, the use of the panel grids and other devices.
Are you reading his Batman stuff now?
I am indeed, yeah. I've been following that. I think that got off to an uneven start. He was matched with the artist David Finch, who is, just in terms of my taste, a fairly conventional superhero artist, a kind of glossy John Buscema. And I don't think that match worked all that well. As he began to work with other artists, including Mitch Gerard, who did The Sheriff of Babylon and is working with Tom King on Mr. Miracle, I thought it became a much more interesting series. And one of the most intriguing aspects of that series is how he is playing with the decades-long relationship between Batman and Catwoman, to the point where Batman has proposed to Catwoman and they are about to get married. It's an interesting take on the character, as always, I think, in mainstream comics. And this is one of the issues that, one of the aspects of mainstream comics that interests me the most. There's that question of whether or not you can actually truly alter the sort of the basic status quo of a character like Batman or Superman. How long will that alteration in the status quo work? When does the series reshift to the basics of the character as a new creative team comes on to it? Is it possible, and we can bring this back to the introduction that Alan Moore wrote for Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns way back in the 1980s, is it possible to really introduce the passage of time, change in human life to these kinds of characters, or do we have to maintain them as commercial properties? You know, endlessly adaptable to movies and toys and television shows. So, as a scholar, that's one of the things that interests me the most.
Yeah, I have just gotten so behind in terms of Batman. I feel that way with a number of series. I just get so behind that I kind of give up and hope that someday I'll have the time to actually get back to it, maybe once it's collected.
Right.
And Batman is one of those series. I kept up with it for a good while, but then, especially since, I think it was keeping up with it with the New 52, and then when they shifted gears about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, I completely lost track of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the issues in mainstream comics, and maybe that's particularly relevant over the summer, which seems to be a time of reboots and restarts, is where do new readers jump in? That usually seems to be the place when a new creative team takes over. How much does that new creative team borrow from the past? How much does it change the character? How long-lasting will those changes be? Of course, right now, one of the things that's coming out in the mainstream, brings all this up again, is Brian Michael Bendis' work on the new Superman series, Man of Steel, which is at once a fresh start, sort of, but at the same time, and here's where you get into some of the complexities of comics history, the title of the series is a callback to John Byrne's restart in 1986. The ads sort of trumpeting Brian Michael Bendis taking over the series were meant to echo Jack Kirby coming to DC in the late 1960s. And I think all of this leads to the question, well, what do these reboots mean? Are they genuinely new story opportunities, or are we just sort of shuffling around narrative conventions and tropes from earlier incarnations? So, does Superman wear red trunks or not? Do character changes from the previous creative team do those remain established, or do they get shunted off into some alternate reality? We just had, under Peter Tomasi and I think Patrick Gleason, a Superman storyline in which he's super dad. He's got a super son, and he's married to Lois Lane. Will that remain the status quo, or is that now sort of shunted off in another direction? Mm-hmm. That adds opportunities for new stories, for revival of older stories, and that sort of tension between experimentation with the characters and, again, a kind of reset of the basic status quo so the characters remain viable as commercial properties. Here I am going off on my academic interest. How much does that impact what creators can do? To me, one of the most fascinating things over more decades than I want to confess of following mainstream comics is that continual tension between the creative ambitions of the writers and the artists and the commercial necessities of characters owned by huge entertainment conglomerates. And that's a fascinating tension that can sometimes result in really great and really resonant stories, and sometimes just fun stories, and sometimes just churning around the same old devices over and over again.
Yeah, I think a cynical take on that, on the constant reboots,
which is well versed.
Yeah, is that publishers are doing this in order to increase sales or to sustain sales. Sustain sales. Yeah. That's true, but it seems to me that when it comes to the superhero genre largely defined, it's become so much a convention, the whole reboot, the restart, the tweaking, that becomes a part of that genre's formula. So if you don't have reboots, that becomes quite odd. And in fact, that is probably what draws a lot of readers. They may miss a certain creative team's take on a particular hero or team. Yeah. Nonetheless, they get something new. So there's this, installation of freshness every now and again that becomes expected. Right. And one of the things that every now and again, I guess the cynical side of me thinks is ridiculous is when you have the exact same creative team, but nonetheless a reboot. With a little change in a hero, like when
listen, that new number one is going to be very valuable.
Daredevil goes to California, and and except for everybody suddenly saying California, and basically you could have taken anything in Hell's Kitchen and just said California. It's like, why?
Okay. So I mean, it is easy to be cynical, but when you think of the superhero genre, the whole reboot, retweaking becomes part and parcel of that formula, and so it becomes expected. And that's one of the things that makes superheroes so different from other kind of comics narratives.
Right, absolutely, yeah.
Well, you can also, I mean, to your point, I mean, you might sort of look at the model of, say, the golden age of Hollywood, where the model sort of, the analogy sort of falls apart, but there are certain things that are common. They were turning out the same plot several times. Sure. I mean, the Maltese Falcon was done 3 times before it became a classic. There isn't anything necessarily wrong with that. I mean, a couple of those you can even watch and enjoy parts of. But invariably, you gotta, the show must go on.
Right.
I mean, the thing that separates, the whole comics genre is that there's now this stable of characters who must go on.
Sure. Yeah. I think the analogy to the Hollywood studio system in the Golden Age is an appropriate analogy, because we are looking at entertainment now conglomerates. They were smaller organizations then, churning out product, and creators working within those constraints, and sometimes able to stamp an individual vision on that work, and sometimes just churning out product.
Yeah, the auteur theory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But there are certain themes, and when you're watching a John Ford Western.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like when you're in a part of the Jack Kirby universe.
Exactly.
Regardless of whichever character he's doing.
Sure.
Yeah. So.
Well, let me kind of shift gears a bit and talk about things from a more indie or alternative perspective and some of the titles that I've been reading. And by the way, one of the things that I will try not to do on these twice-a-month on-location episodes is to read and discuss things that I will be discussing on the weekly review show or even with texts whose creators I'll interview for the show, whether I have interviewed or plan to interview. So in other words, I'll try to do something fresh. And what I did is I read 3 new Image titles, number 1 issues, all of which were released last Wednesday, the 13th. And those 3 titles are Proxima Centauri by Farel Dalrymple, The Weatherman by Jody, LeHeup, and Nathan Fox, and then Stellar, Joe Keatinge, and Bret Blevins. I didn't know exactly what to expect with at least 2 of these, The Weatherman and Stellar. I kind of had an expectation for Dalrymple's Proxima Centauri because I've read Farel Dalrymple stuff, and I know what to expect. Are either of you familiar with Dalrymple?
I just know his work from his collaboration with Jonathan Lethem on Omega the Unknown.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, several years ago came out from Marvel.
See, I'm stuck in the mainstream world again.
Yeah. So, yeah, he has done things in the mainstream, but he's primarily known for doing indie stuff. Now, something that he did relatively recently, at least it was collected recently by Image, and that is This Will All Hurt. And that
Great
includes the original, I guess, webcomics that he published through Study Group, and I think you can still find it on the Study Group side, in addition to new material. And so it's several months ago that Image came out with that trade. I also know Farel Dalrymple's work from several years ago. He had a title from First Second called The Wrenchies, and in fact we had him on the show to talk about The Wrenchies. Now, the world of The Wrenchies and the world of This Will All Hurt, I think, I'd have to go back and look at it carefully, but they seem to be 2 distinct worlds. Maybe there's some overlapping, I'm not entirely sure. But they look relatively the same, and not just in terms of the art, but one of the things that defines the work of Farel Dalrymple is that many times he will write about children or young people on some kind of adventure, not necessarily like the Goonies, but going through some kind of trial, usually darker than you would find with, let's say, the Goonies or Stand By Me. And it's very fantastical, and he creates this world that is outside of the laws of physics, that includes levitation, floating objects, bugs, creatures of various sorts I can't even define. It's really wild. And
X-Men meets a series of unfortunate events.
Or on LSD.
Oh,
cool.
Cool.
If you want to look at it that way.
Okay.
And so when I saw that he had this new series, Proxima Centauri, coming out, I thought, okay, this is going to be something similar to The Wrenchies and This Will All Hurt, and it's going to be rather wild, and it's going to take me maybe several issues to actually get my bearings, because the way that he tells stories, the way that he illustrates those stories, as I suggested, quite surreal and can be very confusing, and it takes you a while to really get into the world and understand what's going on. So my assumption coming to these 3 new Image titles, these 3 number 1s, was that Proxima Centauri would be the one of the 3 that I would be the most confused by. I had the opposite effect. And by the way, I don't know if the mic, I think the mic may be picking up. We have some heavy rain out there, so if you listeners are hearing something in the background, the rainstorm has all of a sudden swept up. But getting back to my point, I found of these 3 titles, Proxima Centauri, The Weatherman, and Stellar, Proxima Centauri making the most sense, which surprised me. And basically what you have, I think that this first issue sets things up in a rather simple but nonetheless intriguing way. We have, whom I assume is the protagonist, a young boy by the name of Sherwood, and he's looking for his brother Orson. And something has happened to Orson. We don't know exactly what. Now, Sherwood is on some kind of world, and it's undefined yet but he can't get off of this world. He wants to go home, but first and foremost, he wants to find his brother Orson. He's bored by this world, and he wants to leave. Another individual that is stuck on this ill-defined world is a character by the name of the Scientist. And we see the Scientist in this first issue working on something, and I believe, if I remember correctly, it's a foot. It looks like a robot foot of some sort. And so he's working on this throughout this first issue, and he's basically telling Sherwood, there's no way to get off. You may as well make the best of it. Don't while away your time. Enjoy what you can, especially because you're young, so enjoy your youth.
This is the Scientist talking?
This is the Scientist talking. There's also a time traveler by the name of Dr. Ext, E-X-T. I'm not exactly sure what to make of him. He's not as prevalent in this first issue, but apparently he's a time traveler because he's known as Dr. Ext, the time traveler. And then there is this, I think she may be a vision of Sherwood, a woman by the name of Parasol. And every now and again you will see this woman, but she's probably a figment of Sherwood's imagination, and he's drawn to her kind of like a girlfriend. So he's drawn to her. He is searching for his brother Orson, and the Scientist, and even Dr. Ext, the time traveler, is telling Sherwood, don't worry about your brother. Don't obsess about this fantasy woman Parasol. Just enjoy whatever it is that he's able to enjoy on this ill-defined world. So that's what we have with this very first issue. Now, it sounds kind of sketchy from the premise that I've established, but it does make sense.
Sure.
And it does set the stage for what's to follow. So I had a pretty good sense of what I can expect, I think, from the second issue that will come out next month. So I'm looking forward to continue that.
So here's just a little bit of a skeptical question. And I'm going to emphasize the skepticism of this and not absolutely buy into that. But with serialized narratives like this, and with so many serialized narratives out there, you're reading the first issue, you're being introduced to a world, and it's not all that uncommon to read the first issue of a series like this and feel like, well, how do I get my bearings in this world? How do I get my bearings in this narrative? How satisfying of a reading experience is that? And what creates that sense of reading satisfaction from something like that?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's one of the things that we keep coming back to on our weekly review shows when we look at number one issues. One of the things that I look for in number one issues, and I think I can say the same for my current co-host, Paul, is that a first issue should stand alone, but at the same time pose a number of questions, significant questions, that will propel you into the following issue or two. In other words, there needs to be that desire to pick up the second issue and then the third issue to find out what happens next. But you can take that a little too far. For instance, if there are too many questions in the first issue, if the creators, for whatever reason, through whatever means, haven't really provided what I consider, let's say, a substantive groundwork.
Sure.
Then that becomes problematic.
Yeah.
And if I have to look at a second issue or wait for a second issue in order to understand what happened in the first issue...
And we're talking about a wait of a month or more sometimes.
Exactly. Then that's a problem.
Yeah.
However, if I can understand what's going on in the first issue and then anticipate and look forward to answering some questions that are posed in the first issue leading to the second and the third, then that's fine. Case in point, another number one issue that I read is Jody LeHeup, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that name. I met him last year, and he told me Leheup, LEHEUP, So Jody LeHeup and Nathan Fox is the artist. Weatherman number one. That was an intriguing first issue, and I wanted to read it because LeHeup was one of the creators behind Shirtless Bear Fighter. I don't know if you guys remember that from last year. And in fact, there is, in the middle of this first issue of The Weatherman, an ad for Shirtless Bear Fighter action figures, which is rather humorous. But so I was really anticipating The Weatherman expecting to enjoy it and to look forward to the second issue. I am looking forward to the second issue, but I have to tell you, the Weatherman #1 is one of those issues that I was describing earlier. I think that there are too many questions in this first issue. In other words, I don't feel I have enough of a firm footing. And maybe it's just me as a reader. I'd be curious if our listeners felt the same way if you read the first issue of the Weatherman. But I just felt that there wasn't really enough there for me to chew on, so to speak. And I know I'm mixing in metaphors. But I mean, it's rather strange. The protagonist is named Nathan Bright, and he is a weatherman, thus the title, on Mars in the year 2770. And he is a rather, I guess, haphazard weatherman. He kind of takes his job seriously, but his employer doesn't think he takes his job seriously. And he is involved, at least by the end of the issue, with law enforcement that at first seemed to be helping him, and then later on at the very end of the issue is arresting him for killing billions of people, and I'm assuming that that's a reference to what's happened to the Earth. Now, again, there's the big question mark when the police tell him that he's under the arrest for soever many billion people. You know, it's like, okay, he destroyed Earth in some way. In what way did he do so? I want to read the second and third issue to find out. But I still don't have
One doesn't imagine a weatherman having quite that much access to nuclear armament.
Right. But I guess my question is, give me a little bit more of this guy's personality. I get some of it, but I don't know enough. In other words, I don't feel satisfied with this first issue. It seems a little incomplete, and I wanted more. I didn't want, everything answered. But I did want more of a firm footing with this very first issue. And I felt the same, I guess, with Stellar #1 by Keatinge and Blevins. The main character is a woman named Stellar, and most of this first issue, she has a prisoner, this weird creature by the name of Melon Karkinos. And we're not exactly sure what Karkinos has done. He's committed several crimes. She tries to take him in for the bounty. But then because of some political changes that have gone on in this world, the political entities that had put the bounty out on Karkinos has shifted, and so she can no longer collect the bounty. So now she's strapped with this criminal who seems to be more like comic relief in this first issue. And I think for me at least, he was the highlight of this. But Stellar tells Karkinos and then others that she was a part of something in the past. And we don't know exactly what that something is. There's some hints of this toward the end of the issue. And at least to my reading, there's a sense that Stellar and several other individuals, Umbra, Aphelion, and Apogee, are characters who are used as human weapons in some way. And I'm not exactly sure in what ways, why they would be weapons, and what kind of world this is. So again, I come away from this first issue with probably too many questions that aren't answered. Again, the bigger ones that will propel me into the second and then the third issue, that's one thing. But I wanted a little more background. And even though I do think that the Weatherman and Stellar has promise, and I'd like to continue on if I have the time to read those, I had much more satisfaction reading the first issue of Dalrymple's Proxima Centauri.
So you've been talking a lot about the story and the characters and the situation and how those things are unveiled in the first issue. How about the art? Is the art enough to bring you back for any of these titles in particular?
Yeah, I think so. With Nathan Fox does a good job with the Weatherman, and I think the same thing with Blevins and Stellar. I'm particularly drawn to, I guess, a more alternative kind of style. Sure. So I will gravitate toward Dalrymple before the others. Not that there's anything wrong with what Fox or Blevins do in the Weatherman and Stellar. Sure. I mean, it's fine art.
And Blevins was a Marvel artist going back to the 1980s, 1990s?
And that first issue of Stellar does have that kind of look.
Yeah.
But it's Dalrymple's art that even if I have to tell you, even if I were very, very confused by this first issue of Proxima Centauri, I probably would definitely pick up the second and third issue just because I love Dalrymple's art.
Sure.
Something else I want to point out in terms of indie, but before I do, we have someone who is joining us now. How you doing, sir?
Hey, my name's Alonzo.
Alonzo.
I've never actually met any of you guys before, but Ziggy speaks highly of both of you, so I'm like pretty psyched to be here right now.
We'll disabuse you of that notion. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well, we had been coming in here once a month. Now we're going to be coming in twice a month and doing these on-location shows. So basically, Mike and I are going to be talking about some of the recent comics that we've been reading. Mike more with the DC, Marvel, mainstream universes. Me more with alternative or indie titles. And then just open up the conversation from there. So anytime during our talk, feel free to jump in if you have your own take or experience reading these titles.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
definitely.
So glad you're joining us.
Thank you.
I'd like to point out that Alonzo has Stan Lee's autograph tattooed on his arm.
Yeah.
That is very impressive.
Yeah, he was like, you got that, you got to come out to a podcast with us. So I was like, yeah, totally. I've never actually, we tried podcasting like when I was like way younger, and I guess that's nothing to you guys, but like when I say way younger, I mean like maybe 15 years ago, like, when I was like 15, 16, and it just didn't work out. So this is interesting to be back into a podcast sort of area. So this is really cool.
So what's the origin story of that tattoo?
Okay, so Stan Lee came to Heroes Comics maybe, I think it was 3 years ago.
I remember,
This was right when I got back from, being on tour and everything.
Yeah.
And so I waited in line for like half the day with everyone else, and I didn't have anything from the sign. People were actually going to like go buy stuff from the sign and everything. I didn't have anything, so I was like, well, I got my arm. I got this free spot on my arm, so I went ahead and had him sign it, and then I wrapped it in like duct tape so it wouldn't wash off. And then I went to the shop, and thank goodness the tape didn't like ruin the writing at all. So, and it's cool that people notice his signature so well, because it's like kind of jagged, but everyone knows his signature is so iconic. So, really cool that people actually know that it's Stan Lee. People who know, some people read it as Stanley, like, who's Stanley? And I'm like, so I know you don't know anything about
who's this guy, Malcolm 10? Okay.
I mean, that's pretty much the origin story of it. I'm glad that he came, because it's probably the only time I'm going to get to see him.
And you have something to remember him by.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't have a cool comic book, but it feels just as good.
Comic books can get lost, not your tattoo.
Exactly. I almost thought that they were going to have to cut my arm off, because he's so exclusive, I have this arm here, take this.
Could be a collectible.
Exactly.
So what's your favorite work by Stan Lee?
So I'm a huge Captain America fan.
Right, yeah.
So I know he didn't have too much to do with all of Captain America, but that's probably I've based my childhood and what I want to grow up to be off of Captain America. So I mean, when I was young, I loved Captain America, and I don't know if you guys know anything about Street Fighter, but there's this army guy, his name's Guile, and pretty much any military-esque figure I've always looked up to as a kid. So pretty much everything from Captain. He was telling me about the new Captain America that I actually haven't even been keeping up with, so I'm kind of ashamed of myself.
The Hydra sleeper agent.
Yeah, so I've read about it, but I haven't been keeping up with the
which was a more interesting storyline, I thought, than the critical reception, maybe the fan reception, is better to say, would lead you to believe.
That was a pretty interesting story that really drew me in. It also, timing is everything.
Absolutely.
And after Trump's election, it started feeling more like a documentary.
And the rhetoric that Nick Spencer gave to Captain America was, at times, quite deliberately reminiscent of Trump.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. No.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, when that was appearing, there was so much outrage. How in the world can anyone make Captain America into a kind of Nazi figure? And here again, I'm sort of reading this stuff and following it online, and I'm just thinking, it's like, do you really believe this is actually going to change the status quo permanently?
Yeah, and that this is like who
Sure.
Roger is.
Yeah. But it did make for an interesting storyline. I think one of the comics that I'm most looking forward to is Ta-Nehisi Coates taking over Captain America, and I believe that first issue comes out in another week or two.
That's something I'm going to look out for.
That's something you can talk about next time.
Yeah.
That is,
I'm ready for it myself.
Yeah.
Do you have it there, or something leading up to it?
It's coming out. No, it's
Yeah,
still Mark Waid.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's the last issue of the Mark Waid run, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as what I've been reading, I was telling him this too, that it's really difficult for me to try and like keep up, because there's so much that you have to do to keep up with everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm like, do I just read like superheroes that I'm interested in, or do I read about things like characters I'm interested in? So I'm interested in Jubilee because I've always felt like she was underrated, because her powers are actually really good, but she just doesn't get a lot of character development.
Yeah.
So I just read Generation X, and that finished up, I think, maybe a month or so ago.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was really fun to read her sort of be a lead role, and like these kids sort of depend on her, and she's like there to protect them. So
Right.
stuff like that, I think I'm more geared towards, like finding a character that I want to just know more about. And just picking up that.
I think one of the challenges today, just given the huge amount of stuff being published, both by mainstream publishers and by independent publishers and people self-publishing, is how do you find your way through that? How do you decide what you're going to read and what you're going to keep up with from month to month, from week to week, for that matter?
Mm-hmm. Well, I come here and sit down with you guys and learn something. I
plan on doing that as well. Learning as much as I can, I guess.
Well, let me use that as a segue to talk about the last title, or at least titles, that I wanted to mention, at least in terms of the alt-indie stuff that I've been reading recently. This past weekend was Heroes Con, and one of the discoveries that I made at Heroes Con this year was the work of Natalie Andrewson. Now, I had read her comics before, but didn't know that I had. She was in an issue of an anthology out of Latvia called Shh. It actually is called Shh. It's pronounced Shh. But she was in an anthology of Shh that came out last year, and we actually discussed it on the show. But, I didn't know who this was until I met her this past weekend. But I got several of her mini-comics, and I have 3 of them here, and I think that they're fascinating works. Her most recent work that came out, she said not too long ago, is called Mad Girl. But there were a couple of others that I brought in with me, one called Haunted and another called Swim Team Superstar. And the thing about these mini-comics is, well, first and foremost, they're mini-comics, so there's not really much story there. I really enjoy the art. She does a risograph style, and she talked. In fact, I even interviewed her briefly for the podcast, and she talked about that process a little bit. And one of the things that you can find in terms of her mini comics is there is this sense of empowerment and of independence, especially when it comes to a woman's voice. And so, for instance, in Mad Girl, basically it is a story of this young woman who is saying, you can't, so to speak, you can't put me in my place, you can't silence me, I want to do things, I want to do what I want, I have a voice. And so basically it's a series of her asserting herself. And you have something, to some degree or another, going on with Swim Team Superstar and also Haunted. Some of these have an autobiographical link to her life, especially Swim Team Superstar. She told me this past weekend that she was on a swim team. And it's about her experiences, or at least it's loosely based on her experiences being on a swim team. And then you have something similar going on in Haunted in terms of an assertion of a particular voice. I really like the art style, and if you're looking at these mini comics primarily for story, for narrative, you're not going to get much. But to me, one of the things that draws me to these mini-comics in particular, but I think you could say with many other mini-comics, it's not so much the story as it is the art, because you really don't have much space for story. I think she has a phenomenal style, and I also learned that next year she has her first book coming out through First Second. It's called Nutcracker, and it's going to be based on the Nutcracker Suite, but kind of a darker version of that. So yeah, she's someone who apparently is up and coming, and I also learned that she is a native Charlottean. Living in Brooklyn now, but from Charlotte, so there you go. So that's another one of my recent finds. So I would put that along with these image titles, especially Proxima Centauri, as something definitely to turn to.
Just glancing at these copies that we've got on the table in front of us, they're just beautifully designed objects as well.
Right.
And I think one of the great things about comics now, in all ways, stretching, again, from the mainstream to independent to self-published titles, is just the sheer beauty of the objects that are being published. There are, of course, this is the golden age of books featuring comic art and reproductions of those. If we want to cite a piece of critical writing, terrific critical book about comics by Scott Bucatman called Hellboy's World, which I was turned on to by Craig Fisher, a great scholar of comics. And one of the themes of that book is just simply the beauty of books as physical objects. And Bucatman talks about that in pretty great detail, and talks about just the renaissance of publication and book design, and in the case even of single-issue design that we're seeing in the world of comics now.
That's just what I was about to say, like this, the sort of the platform she's chosen is really
that's a nice
interesting,
term.
And how like this isn't the traditional looking comic book, but it's just enough to sort of catch your eye and take a look at it. You know?
Okay, so I need to ask, what'd you pay for it?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I can't remember, but the thing about mini comics, they are going to be proportionally a little more pricey.
Yeah.
So it's $5-6. So, again,
perfectly reasonable.
Much more than you would pay for a single issue of just a regular comic book.
But you're also dealing with almost a handmade art object.
Exactly,
as well.
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you were talking about the materiality of mini comics. That's one of the things that really draws me to mini comics. And you don't find that many at, let's say, conventions like, let's say, Heroes Con, as great as it is. That's something, in terms of the mini comics, you find in abundance at Small Press Expo in the fall, which I love to go to. I love SPX. And so it's just filled with people who do these kind of comics. And you're right, they are handmade objects, and there is something to holding the object in your hand. For instance, if I would scan this and save it as a PDF and then read it on my tablet, definitely wouldn't be the same experience. And again, coming back to, Mike, your comment about the materiality of the mini-comics, it also reminds me of one of the panels that I was on at HeroesCon this past weekend that was based on a critical book that Aaron Cashton came out with recently called Between Pen and Pixel, where he talks about comics, its materiality, and also the digital versions of it. And what he does is he links this to kind of a larger argument of digital text. For instance, it could be prose text. Is the printed book dead or not? And
no.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely not. Right. But
Absolutely not.
I'll second that controversial stand.
But he poses that as a question because many people ask that when it comes to the proliferation over the past several years of digital text. But what he does is he uses comics as an example because comics, by their very nature, we're made aware of the objectness of a comic book, whether it be something like a mini comic or whether it be something from Marvel, like Zig you have right here, that we could read that digitally, but there's something about picking that up. There's something about turning a particular page, or even the smell of that. And there's certain comics, I guess, like mini comics, that really digital doesn't do it justice. So, for instance, if you wanted to
testify.
if you wanted to read this issue of Judge Dredd that you have in front of you, digitally, you could,
And I have.
And maybe there may not be that much of a difference between reading it in print and reading it digitally. But then there are other texts, and of course a great example of that is Chris Ware's Building Stories, where the materiality of the text, now they do have building stories in digital format, but it's not the same thing as reading it in hard copy. And to call it a book, I think it's to stretch. I don't know if you guys have seen Building Stories. Yeah. It comes in a box about the size of a game, and it has, something like 13 different components that range from a more typical comic book to like a little golden book to a fold-out accordion. In other words, you're holding a comic, loosely defined, and reading it because you have to take the various pieces out of the box in order to get the story. And sometimes you become literally painfully aware that this is a material object that you're holding, because the way that you hold a certain component of Building Stories can hurt your arms, and I can testify to that if you have to hold it for very long at a certain angle. So, so that panel was all about the not so much tension, but maybe even the complementary relationship between digital and print. Because there are certain things, on the other hand, you can do with digital that you can't do with print.
I being a big Judge Dredd 2000 AD fan, I can get this stuff digitally and I can get it the same time they get it in the UK. On the other hand, and I did that for a couple of years on my iPad, and I kind of was in hog heaven. But
can you see that actually a page at a time? Or are you seeing it a panel at a time?
I'm seeing it a page at a time.
Okay, so you are seeing the entire page laid out.
I'm seeing an entire page laid out. But, I'm not, and I could see 2 pages laid out, but then it's much smaller.
Right,
I lose a lot of the effect.
Right.
Yeah. And there were actually some, and in 2000 AD, there are some things that you just need to, that you just want to see in terms of how these things flow. Like, digitally I missed. They had this brilliant sequence 2-3 years back called Triptych, where they had 3 stories from different storylines in the Dredd universe that all converged. We didn't know this ahead of time, but they all converged into one story in one issue, and it blended beautifully.
Wow.
Which I just would have missed. I missed that digitally because I didn't start with the Dredd story, and it did come in, but I missed a little bit of the impact. But
I think your eye roams around the page in a different way than it roams around the screen.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And there are some images that are like both pages. It's just a huge image that you really need to see. If you can only see a page at a time.
How are you going to get a double-page spread by Jack Kirby?
Exactly.
On a screen? There's that wonderful double-page spread, early issue of New Gods of, the Promethean giants who were chained to the asteroids, and you've got the body positioned in a way so that it seems to be coming towards you out of the page. You need to see that on the page. And you need, going back to the smell, the smell of decaying newsprint is like nothing else.
Mm-hmm. But there is like webcomics that's huge nowadays. Sure. I think it was Webtoons that was at Heroes Con, and I had no idea what it was, but I walked by and they're like, oh yeah, there's all these iconic characters that are coming out of Webtoons that are like now getting comics. So I guess they are sort of working both platforms, or they have to now. That their popularity is growing. People want these things in their hands and not just on Webtoons. And I actually subscribed to it that day when I saw it, because they said you can read comics there for free. I was like, yes, I'm all for reading comics for free. So yeah, definitely Webtoons is cool.
Yeah, I was really surprised to see how big of a display or booth that Webtoons had, and I wasn't aware of it at first. I remember my first day there.
Yeah,
I became aware of Webtoons' presence indirectly because I saw a lot of people carrying these gigantic bags over their shoulder that had Webtoons on it and had various characters from
really
Webtoon
good
webcomics.
Yep.
Yeah, and I thought, where'd they get these? And is Webtoons here? And I didn't think that they went around to cons, but actually they've just recently started to do that. And at one point, I had planned on going by and talking with, I guess she was a publicist who's there with Webtoon. She wanted to talk with me because we do, for the Comics Alternative, a monthly webcomics series. And we've actually looked at a number of webcomics based on Webtoon, the Webtoons platform, in the past. So I wanted to talk with her about that, but I never got around to being at the booth when she was there. I planned on going to talk with her on Sunday, but I decided not to go back to the con on Sunday. So I didn't get to talk with her. But yeah, they had a gigantic booth. They had a lot of publicity. And it's really interesting. I think they generated quite a bit of interest because there were a lot of people like you who didn't even know that existed before. And then they had this big booth there, and they had contests, and they had giveaways. Wow, that's a big deal. And
they have an app, too. So, you can read free comics, and you can just pull it up on your phone. But then again, I guess that's even weirder. You're not only reading, we're talking about reading from a computer screen, but also reading from, your phone. How, immersive is that, really? I haven't gotten into the app yet, but...
Well, it depends on what kind of meal you're in the mood for. Right. I mean, you need to sit down, or do you just need to throw in some chewing, or do you just need to have a stick of chewing gum just to keep you pacified? I mean, Doonesbury on a phone's fine. Heck, even Spider-Man has had a daily strip. If you want to follow... the arc of, the current Doctor Strange or something like that. Different thing.
Yeah. Now, see, what's interesting about Webtoons webcomics is that even though you can view them on an app, like on your phone or on your tablet, it's nonetheless a webcomic. Now, because I read Webtoon webcomics whenever I do so on my computer through a web browser. And there are certain other platforms that deal with comics digitally where they're not so much webcomics as they are digital comics. And the difference between the two...
Comicology.
Right, yeah. And the difference between the two is with webcomics, you, I guess, primarily can view them through a web browser. Thus a web comic web browser. They're on the World Wide Web.
Right.
But then there are other platforms, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I think that Stila is one of these platforms that you need the app in order to read the comic. In other words, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you can see it through a web browser. In other words, you can't pull up, Explorer or Safari or whatever browser you use and then just start reading their comics. You have to get the app. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make it a webcomic, though. It makes it a digital comic.
Right, okay. Actually, I didn't know that there was a difference between things you can only use on phone and things you can only find on the internet.
What's interesting, and this is something I keep coming back to probably too much, is you not knowing the difference between a digital comic and a webcomic. You were in the same boat as, for quite a number of years, the judges of the Eisner Awards, because they would lump the two together for a number of years, I guess until last year, and then they separated the webcomics from the digital comics category. Now, the problem with last year is that in the webcomics category, there were some digital comics that weren't webcomics. And in the digital comic category, they included webcomics. And so it's like, okay, it's good that you made this division. On the other hand, there's no distinguishing definition or characteristics that's discernible from you splitting these two up. Now, this year's a little different. So with their webcomics, they're webcomics. And the digital comics, they're digital comics. But it's interesting, they're both digital. Webcomics are digital, but they're not digitally delivered comics like you would find on, let's say, Stila, or Comixology is a good example of that. And usually with digital comics, it's primarily, I guess, a reproduction. It doesn't necessarily have to be a reproduction of something in print because, you have original stuff on Stila. But it's like this Judge Dredd, right? So if you have a digital version of that you get on Comixology, it's a digital comic. Just because you see it digitally, it doesn't make it a webcomic.
Gotcha. I mean, the one thing I will say for the, digital comics is you can find some stuff in the back catalog a lot easier. Which, if you're looking for some of it, that's not a bad spot.
Do any of you guys have Marvel Unlimited?
No.
Yeah.
Nah. I mean, to me, part of the fun is coming to the store. If I wanted to go total Howard Hughes and live, let my fingernails grow and everything. Yeah, I do Marvel Unlimited. Yeah, let's not go there. Let's not go there.
Too late.
Man.
Too late. Sorry.
All right.
Just what I do.
Yeah, I was really keeping out of that.
Avoiding it, yeah.
But part of the whole experience is being able to come to stores and look around.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you see other. I mean, just because you can look around and see other stuff, you might pick up and try out.
Yeah. Like my favorite thing is Monsters from several months ago. You discovered that.
Yeah. I discovered that. I tried to get my wife reading it, and she recoiled in horror. But that's okay. There's other stuff she'll read.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
Well, she reads comics. But I don't think my girlfriend is into that stuff. So
maybe they come along, maybe they don't.
You like playing the games.
Yeah.
Just not, sitting down and reading. I guess it's too much time consuming. But it's a video game too. Video games are just as time consuming.
No, but video games are like a total mind suck, man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
I mean, they are a
agree.
black hole of time. I mean, a comic book you can pick up, read, discard.
And it only takes like maybe 15 minutes. If you're really interested, it takes 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's display the same kind of openness and tolerance for games as we expect people to,
I'm
to
sorry.
display
No,
for
I was
comics.
allow me to point out I am not trying to diss video games, which is a medium I greatly enjoy and participate in. But let's face it, the amount of time that a video game takes is huge if you're trying to get all the achievements and things. And actually, in the Batman video game, I actually wound up finding a kid to get one of the achievements for me so I could get Catwoman to proposition me. Okay.
So that is one of the rewards of the Batman video game.
That is one of the rewards of the, what is it, Batman Arkham
I think it was
City, the third one.
The third one. That was
you needed to where Catwoman is held prisoner by the Riddler and Batman needs to do all these.
Yeah. I actually didn't finish that game. You finished it.
I finished it. Well, in the end I needed to go to Craigslist and find a 20-something who'd pilot the Batmobile for me. Because I was ashamed to
those
ask
achievements are tough, though.
Yeah,
the Batmobile achievements are tough. Yeah.
Hold on. Yeah. You went to Craigslist.
I went to Craigslist
to have someone help you finish the game.
To have someone help. I paid some kid $20 to get this achievement for me, all so that I could have Catwoman proposition me.
That is awesome.
Well,
that is awesome.
No, what is awesome is that this is very therapeutic. Thank you.
Right.
I don't think I would ever have been able to admit this if I hadn't been sitting in front of a microphone.
Yeah.
No. I don't think it was awesome, but I'll cop to it. I'll admit it. But
the fact that
so I'm not dissing video games.
Yeah. The fact that Craigslist is the type of place where you can find someone to get an achievement for a video game for you is awesome.
Well, I also felt that I needed to say, check if you're under 18, check with your parents before you respond.
That's actually
okay.
Pretty good. You did that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. All right, this is a new world for me. I'm not a gamer, so
we'll talk about Spider-Man when it comes out. It's coming out soon. So
in fact, I was just going to ask you guys. I mean, what are you? Because Mike and I have been talking about things that we've been reading recently that interests us. What are you looking forward to? I mean, obviously, you had mentioned the new Captain America.
Right,
but,
so John Wick. John Wick is I think it's the independent comic right now, but John Wick had one issue maybe 3 months back. I read that.
I think they're published through, is it Titan or Boom?
I think so.
Or Dynamite? I don't know. It's one of those. It's not Image, definitely.
Yeah, I am reading Crosswinds, though, from that one. So I'm the impression of that story is pretty cool. But yeah, John Wick, just because I love the movies.
Okay.
So when they were releasing a comic, I was pretty hyped about it. So it's sort of like his origin story. It tells a lot about how he grew up as a kid. So, and since there's eventually going to be a third one, they announced the third one. So getting into the comic is definitely something I'm looking forward to. I think it's only 3 or 4 issues in right now, baby.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to that progressing more.
Okay. I'm looking forward to Babs Tarr drawing Judge Dredd for the summer science fiction special, which I believe is out in the UK today, meaning I'll get it next month. But and I actually wound up seeing standing in line to talk to her, to tell her how much I was looking forward to it, because based on her wonderful artwork drawing Batgirl on the Bat Cycle.
Because she was at HeroesCon,
she
right?
was at HeroesCon, yeah. Yes, I just, and she showed me some of her early work on it. So I was like, yes, score, okay. Mm-hmm. And it's, she's just so wonderfully dramatic on those motorcycle scenes. I'm just looking forward to those.
Mike, are you looking forward to anything in addition to the Captain America?
I'll cite one of the IDW artist editions that's coming out in another week or so. It is some of Jack Kirby's early work for Marvel. And it's Monsters and Mutants, I believe, is the title of it. So going back to the early tales of suspense, journey into mystery in the late 50s, early 1960s, on into issues of X-Men, Avengers, Rawhide Kid, Sergeant Fury. I think those artist editions are just among the most... I was talking before about book production. Just among the most gorgeous productions, and a very dangerous addiction. One reason I could not afford being introduced to the world of gaming, because I'm sunk already with these.
But please tell me that your university a library will pick up some of these for you.
I have not asked.
The artist editions?
They're all mine.
Okay.
How many do you have?
I've got probably about 10 to 12 or so.
Wow.
I think particularly when you go back to things, the more recent comics work that is produced in those artist editions is not markedly different given the sophistication of printing techniques that we've seen over the last decade or so, several decades. On the other hand, when you go back and you look at the reproduction of EC comics from the 1950s, Will Eisner's Spirit, and those early Marvel comics, it's just amazing. We've never seen that artwork in that format before. We've never seen the crispness of it. And it's just, it's remarkable. It's radical to see those things.
I've only got 2, and both of those are Spirit volumes.
Yeah, those are beautiful volumes.
So there's those. And actually, that leads me then to one of the things, I didn't even think about this until you mentioned artist editions. One of the things I'm looking forward to, I guess later this summer is going to be coming out, is, I think it's called the Curator's Edition. This is Dark Horse that's putting it out. Contract with God.
Ooh, interesting.
And so you have like an artist edition of Contract with God, but you also have original essays in that as well. Yeah. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I've got that on order. But what I was going to say that I'm definitely looking forward to, and I didn't know about this, I think it was just announced today from IDW. I got an email about it, but I found out about it over the weekend. Rich Tommaso was at HeroesCon, and one of the things he had there with him was some original artwork for his next project, which he's doing with the All Reds, a new Dick Tracy.
Wow.
And so he is, the All Reds are writing it. Rich Tommaso is doing the art. And so it's going to be, I don't know, maybe a 6-issue run of Dick Tracy, and they want to see how it flies and if it has any interest. And if there is enough interest there, then they're going to, come up with, I guess, a second narrative arc and just see how long it goes. But I think it's exciting that we have this new take on Dick Tracy, and it just makes perfect sense that Rich Tommaso does this, because one of the things that Tommaso does so well is crime or detective comics.
Any idea on how they're morphing it?
Yeah.
I mean, is it Dick Tracy CSI?
They're going to update it somewhat, but then again, you're dealing with a character who in certain ways had technology that anticipates what we have right now. I mean, the watch on my wrist is not as sophisticated as Dick Tracy's, but it's going to be interesting how they work with that, and I'm going to be even more interested, I think, in the kind of reception that title gets. Now that's going to be coming out in September, so we have a little time to wait until that's released. But
you can see how something like that breaks out. Can it break out in a market as crowded as this?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, well, stuff does break out in a market as crowded as
this. Yeah.
So, but what does make it break out?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we will be here probably, I guess, I don't know, Mike and I haven't set a date yet, but I guess on a month-by-month basis we'll find Wednesdays that work with us. So it should be, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks, the first part of July that we'll be back here. I'll send an email out, and in fact, remind me to, when we turn off the mic, to get your contact information, to put you on the Facebook messaging list. But I want to thank, again, the good folks at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find at 417 Pecan Avenue for allowing us to come into their shop and talk comics. So if you're in the area, even if you're not in the area, definitely make an effort to come to 417 Pecan Avenue. Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. You will not be disappointed. And if you want to get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our new format for the On Location show, which we'll be doing twice a month now, then definitely get in touch with us. We want to hear from you. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com. If you want to contact me directly, I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Mike, how can they get in touch with you?
Michael at comicsalternative.com. Once I learn how to activate the email, that is.
We also have accounts all over social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on the blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So, guys, it's been a rollicking, fun conversation, and it's not often that you hear the word rollicking on podcasts, I would guess.
It's really not, yeah.
So, thanks, and we will be talking with you guys, I hope, in another couple of weeks or so.
Dude, I'm ready.
All right, thanks, guys.
Okay. I'm ready.
You're rearing to go.
I won't bring up Howard Hughes's personal foibles again.
Okay.
But I don't guarantee going in that direction, and with somebody else entirely.
I hear you, man.
Yeah.
It's cool.